made in the assembly that a powerful species didn't like, or when a decision was being pushed through too fast, or when someone tested the edges of what the new charter permitted. Someone would say, usually quietly, usually without emphasis, "The humans are watching." It was never said as a threat, it was said as a fact, and it was always enough. Because the galaxy remembered, in the way that galaxies remember things that happen fast and matter completely, what had happened when people forgot that humanity was paying attention. It remembered a fleet that came out of the dark, built from ships that should have been forgotten, crewed by people who had been left to die and had decided not to. It remembered that humans did not stop, that they adapted and persisted and planned and came, in the end, with more ships than anyone had accounted for, and a charter drafted on a warship between battles. It remembered that they had won and then had chosen, deliberately, not to become what they defeated. That was the part that stuck, the part that was hardest to dismiss, the part that lingered in the reports of diplomatic analysts and the personal journals of assembly representatives, and the late-night conversations of species who were still figuring out what the new shape of the galaxy meant for them. They had won, and they had stopped, not because they couldn't have taken more. Everyone who had been at Orath knew they could have taken more, because they had decided that taking more wasn't the point. Nobody tried to disarm humanity again. Nobody thought about it twice. The stars were still out there, cold and distant and vast, full of things that hadn't happened yet, and problems that hadn't arrived, and species that hadn't been met, and questions that hadn't been asked. Humanity was watching, and that in the end was enough. The deep black between stars was not empty, it never really was. It was full of old things, dead rocks, broken light, the cold dust of worlds that had burned out before humanity learned to walk upright. But on the edge of the Sol system, past the last known asteroid belt, past the lonely drifting rocks that even the survey teams had stopped bothering to name, there was something new in the old dark, or rather, something very old in the wrong place. Commander Dara Osei saw it first on the long-range scan. She was sitting in the pilot chair of the ISV Tenacious, a salvage vessel that had seen better decades, nursing a cup of cold coffee and reading through maintenance logs that made her quietly sad. The Tenacious was not a glamorous ship. Right, it was wide and slow and smelled faintly of machine oil and recycled air, and the particular kind of tired that comes from years of hard use. The crew called it home. That was enough. The scan pinged. Dara leaned forward. The number on the screen didn't make sense. The mass reading was enormous. Not asteroid enormous, not comet enormous. Something else. Something big in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. She called her engineer, a wide-shouldered man named Tobias Crane, who came up from the lower deck with grease on his hands and sleep in his eyes. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. "That can't be right," he said. "I know," Dara said. "That's reading nearly 3 kilometers long." "I know." He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. "We going to look?" Dara was already adjusting course. "Hey, we're going to look," she said. It took 6 hours to close the distance. As they got closer, the shape on the scanner became clearer and clearer, and by the time it finally filled the forward viewport, the entire crew of 11 had gathered on the bridge and nobody was saying anything. They just stood and stared. It was a warship. It was the biggest thing any of them had ever seen in person, bigger than anything humanity had ever built, bigger than the orbital stations, bigger than the colony transports. It was shaped like something between a blade and a fist, all hard angles and sweeping curves, built from a dark metal that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The hull was scorched in places, split open in others, great tears running along its flanks like wounds that had never healed. One of its engine pods was simply gone, not damaged, not broken, gone as if something had reached out and torn it away. Strange symbols were burned into the metal near the bow, large enough that Dara could read them clearly from half a kilometer out, even without magnification. "Those are convergence sigils," said Dr. Marasolis, the crew's xenologist, who had pressed herself close to the glass with both hands flat against the viewport. Her voice was quiet. "That's a convergence military vessel." "What's it doing out here?" someone asked. Nobody had an answer. Then the beacon signal reached them. It had been broadcasting all along, but they'd been too far out to catch it clearly. Now it came through the comms in clean, cold tones, the same message repeating over and over in 17 different languages. Aki cycling through them one by one. When it reached the human language translation, the ship's system read it aloud in a flat, automated voice. Contaminated. Condemned. Do not approach. This vessel is the property of the galactic convergence. It has sustained irreparable damage and poses a hazard to all craft in proximity. Retrieval is not planned. Approach is forbidden. This message will repeat. The message repeated. Dara listened to it twice. Then she turned to Tobias. Get me a suit, she said. Tobias looked at her. It said do not approach. It did, Dara agreed. Get me a suit. The airlock of the alien warship was not designed for human hands. That was the first problem. And the first problem humanity would solve that day, though certainly not the last. The exterior access panel was a flat surface of smooth dark metal with no visible seam, no handle, no button. It expected a specific kind of touch from a specific kind of hand. A hand with more fingers than a human had, arranged in a pattern no human palm could replicate. Dara stood outside it in her pressure suit, magnetic boots locked to the hull, and studied the panel for a long moment. Then she pulled a flat cutting tool from her belt and got to work. It took 20 minutes to open a panel that the ship's original crew could have opened in 3 seconds. She didn't mind. She was used to things taking longer than they should. Inside, the ship was dark and cold and very, very large. The corridors were wide enough for 3 people walking side by side with room to spare. The ceilings were high. And everything was built for being slightly taller and broader than humans. And there was a weight to the architecture, a sense of mass and permanence, that made the salvage crew feel small without making them feel unwelcome. It was like walking into a cathedral that had been built by giants and abandoned by gods. Emergency lighting kicked on as they moved deeper, dim red strips along the floor that cast strange shadows and made everything look like the inside of a sleeping thing. Dara's suit scanner ran constantly, feeding data back to the Tenacious. Tobias walked beside her, and Dr. Solis walked just behind, cataloging everything she could see with a handheld recorder. This is a Keth-class warship, Solis said, her voice hushed. The Sithari built these. I've only ever seen images. She paused at a junction where the corridor split 3 ways. The walls here were covered in carved relief, scenes of battle done in precise, angular lines. They called this class the Var-Keth. It means roughly, the fist of judgment. Poetic, said Tobias. They're a poetic species, Solis said, when they're not destroying things. They moved through the ship for hours. What they found was staggering. The drive cores, 3 of them, arranged in a triangular configuration deep in the ship's belly, were damaged, yes. One was cracked along its central housing, leaking a faint blue luminescence into the surrounding chamber. But 2 of the others were intact. Not just structurally intact, they still held charge. They were still, after however long the ship had been drifting, or holding some fraction of their original power. These things are still alive, Tobias said, standing before the central core with his scanner raised. He was trying to keep his voice professional. He wasn't fully succeeding. Dara, if these cores are what I think they are, if the specs on Keth-class drives are anywhere close to accurate, these are running on technology 50 years ahead of anything we've got. More than 50, Solis said quietly. And they just left them, Tobias said. He couldn't get past it. He kept saying it, in different ways, for the rest of the time they were inside. They just left them. They left all of this. The weapons systems were another story entirely. Most were fused, melted together by whatever battle had crippled the ship. Their moving parts locked solid, their power feeds severed. But the physical structures were sound. The barrels of the main rail cannons were intact. The launch tubes for the long-range ordnance were open and clear. And deep in the forward weapons bay, half buried in collapsed internal plating, there was something that none of them recognized. It was long and dark and shaped like nothing in any human or known alien weapons catalog. A device embedded in the hull itself, its front end protruding slightly through the outer armor, its back end trailing wires and tubing that connected to systems Solis couldn't identify. What is that? Dara asked. Solis scanned it carefully before answering. She turned the scanner over in her hands and looked at the readings twice. I don't know, she said, but whatever hit this ship, I think this was its weapon. Dara looked at the device for a long moment. Aditi, leave it for now, she said. Don't touch it. Mark the location. They moved on. The hull plating, when Tobias ran a sample analysis on a section of the outer wall, came back with results that made him sit down on the floor of the corridor and stare at his scanner screen in silence for a full minute. Talk to me, Dara said. This alloy, Tobias said slowly, has a tensile strength that I can't. The numbers don't fit into our standard measurement scale. I'm not saying it's off the chart. I'm saying it breaks the chart. The chart needs to be longer. He looked up at her. You could put a standard human military railgun round into this plating at point-blank range, and it would bounce off like a rubber ball. The crew was quiet for a moment. They called it condemned, someone said from the back. Oh, they called it irreparable, someone else said. Dara stood in the middle of that vast, dark corridor, surrounded by alien metal and alien light, and the weight of something enormous. Not just the ship, but the possibility of it. And she made a decision. It wasn't a hard decision. For her, it never really was. When she saw something broken that could be fixed, the question wasn't, should we? The question was only ever how. She keyed her comms back to the Tenacious. This is Osei. Get me a secure channel back to the Unified Space Authority. Priority transmission. The comms officer on the Tenacious patched the channel through. There was the usual delay, the usual handshake protocols, the usual series of tones that meant the encryption was working. Then the line opened. Dara looked around at the corridor, at the dark metal walls, at the impossible engineering surrounding her, at the two intact drive cores still breathing faint blue light behind her. We're going to need bigger docking clamps, she said. The response from Earth came in 3 waves. The first wave was disbelief. The Unified Space Authority's duty officer asked Dara to repeat herself, then asked her to run her scanners again, then asked her to send the raw data, then went quiet for a long time. When he came back on the line, his voice had changed. He sounded the way people sound when something has shifted in their understanding of the world and they haven't quite caught up yet. The second wave was bureaucracy, forms, authorizations, legal questions about salvage rights in the outer heliosphere, questions about contamination protocols. The beacon had said contaminated after all, though none of Dara's bioscanners had picked up anything unusual. Questions about convergence, diplomatic implications. Questions about who would own what and how and when. Dara answered the questions she could and ignored the ones she couldn't and kept her crew working in the meantime. She had the Tenacious dock loosely against the alien hull and set up a temporary pressurized connection, and her people went in and out in rotating shifts, cataloging, scanning, documenting everything they could reach. The third wave was the one that mattered. It came 48 hours after her first transmission, and it wasn't a voice message. It was a full committee. 7 people on the video screen, some of them in suits, some in military uniforms. All of them with the specific expression of people who have just been told something that changes their plans and are trying to look calm about it. The woman in the center of the screen was Director Amara Fujiwara of the Space Authority's Deep Salvage Division, a small, precise woman with short gray hair and eyes that moved constantly, assessing everything. She looked at Dara for a long moment before speaking. Commander Osei, she said, we've reviewed your data. And, Dara said, and we're sending you a tow team. 80 personnel, 6 support vessels. They'll be at your position in 11 days. A pause. In the meantime, you are to maintain your position, continue your documentation, and under no circumstances are you to touch the drive cores or any identified weapon systems until our people arrive. Dara nodded. She thought about the device in the forward weapons bay, the one that might have been a weapon, the one that was still embedded in the hull like a tooth. Understood, she said. After the call ended, Tobias appeared at her elbow. They said not to touch the weapon systems, he said. They did, Dara agreed. Does that include the thing we don't know is a weapon? Dara thought about it. We're not touching it, she said. We're studying it. Tobias nodded slowly. Right, he said. Right, of course. Very different. Over the next 11 days, the crew of the Tenacious learned things. They learned the layout of the ship well enough that they could move through it without their maps. They learned which corridors still had functioning emergency systems and which were fully dead. They learned that the alien vessel, which doctor, Solus had confirmed from markings near what appeared to be a command center, was named the Varketh Sovereign, had a crew capacity of approximately 800 beings, and that not one of those beings was still aboard. No bodies, no personal effects. The ship had been evacuated before it was abandoned. Whatever had happened, the Convergence had taken their people with them. They had just left everything else. They learned from Solus's patient work with the ship's partially intact data systems, fragments of what had happened. The Sovereign had been engaged by the Nullborn, a force even the Convergence discussed in careful, quiet tones, in a battle near a relay station several light years from the Sol system. The ship had taken catastrophic damage. The Convergence engineers who evaluated it afterward had concluded that the cost of repair would exceed the value of the vessel, and so the order had been given: evacuate, condemn, abandon. The Convergence was a practical civilization. They understood the math of loss. What they did not understand, what they could not have understood, because they had never had reason to learn it, was that humanity had a different relationship with broken things. Humans fix things. It was not always rational. It was not always cost-effective. Sometimes it was pure stubbornness, pure refusal to accept that something was gone simply because it was damaged. A species that had spent 10,000 years repairing tools, rebuilding cities, splinting bones and patching ships and pulling crops out of ruined soil had developed, was deep in its collective character, an almost instinctive resistance to the idea of giving up on something that still had pieces. The Sovereign had pieces, many, many pieces. And when the tow team arrived on day 11, 6 ships, 80 people, equipment that filled the Tenacious's comms with chatter and the surrounding space with running lights, Dara stood at the viewport and watched them come and felt something that she recognized as a kind of hunger. Not greed, not ambition exactly, something older than both. The hunger to take a broken thing and make it whole. The lead engineer on the tow team was a tall, thin man named Kwame Asante, who shook Dara's hand with both of his and immediately asked to see the drive cores. She led him there herself. He stood in front of them for a long time, the way Tobias had. But where Tobias had gone still with awe, Kwame went still with calculation. His eyes moved. His fingers moved, tapping patterns against his thigh, a habit she would come to recognize as him running numbers in his head. "We can work with this," he said finally. "The Convergence said it was irreparable," Dara said, watching him. Kwame looked at her. He was smiling, but it was a serious smile, the kind that means, "I am not joking about this." "With respect to the Convergence," he said, "they were thinking about what they knew how to do. I'm thinking about what we haven't tried yet." He turned back to the drive cores, and the hunger in his eyes matched what Dara felt. They began the long work. It took 6 days to rig the tow. Careful, slow work. You attaching guidelines and stabilizing thrusters to the Sovereign's hull without stressing the already damaged sections further. Kwame's team worked in shifts, sleeping in rotation, eating in their suits sometimes because stopping felt wrong. When the tow finally began, when the 6 support vessels engaged their drives and the Sovereign began slowly to move, Dara was watching from the Tenacious's viewport. The alien ship was enormous against the starfield, dark and broken and ancient and full of possibility. She thought about the beacon still broadcasting from somewhere inside it, contaminated, condemned, do not approach. She thought about the drive cores still breathing their blue light. She thought about the weapon in the forward bay, the long, dark thing that had been fired at this ship and was now part of it, unembedded in its hull like something that had been swallowed and kept. She thought about where this ship was going, about the forge station that the Space Authority had already begun building in the outer belt, a station designed specifically for this task, for taking this ship apart and understanding it and putting it back together into something new, about the engineers who were already being recruited, the metallurgists and xenotechnicians and weapons specialists and hull designers who would spend the next months or years of their lives inside this vessel, learning its bones. She thought about the Convergence, who had decided this ship was worth nothing. She keyed her comms. "Tenacious to tow team," she said. "Let's bring her home." The news broke on a Tuesday. It didn't break gently. It broke the way big news always breaks. First in fragments, leaked sensor data, and blurry long-range images passed between engineering forums and deep space hobbyist networks. Then in growing waves as the larger outlets picked it up. And then all at once, everywhere, in every language humanity spoke, with headlines that ranged from cautious to breathless to outright disbelieving. Salvage team recovers alien warship in outer heliosphere. Human crew boards abandoned Convergence vessel. Dares diplomatic incident. The find of the century. What is humanity going to do with a 3-kilometer alien battleship? The Unified Space Authority released a short, careful statement confirming that yes, an abandoned vessel of Convergence origin had been located, recovered under interstellar salvage law, and was being transported to a secure facility for assessment. The statement used the word assessment 4 times. It did not use the words rebuild, refit, or weapon. It did not mention the drive cores, or the hull plating, or the dark device embedded in the forward bow. But people talked. People always talked. And within a week, the shape of what was really happening had filtered out through the noise. Humanity had found the most advanced piece of alien engineering ever to fall into human hands, and they were not going to give it back. The Convergence's response came 8 days after the initial announcement. It arrived as a formal diplomatic transmission, addressed to the Unified Space Authority and copied to every major human government. The message was polite, it was also very firm. The Varketh Sovereign was Convergence military property. It had been officially decommissioned, yes, but decommissioning did not constitute abandonment under Convergence interstellar law. Humanity was requested, strongly requested, to halt all work on the vessel and arrange for its return to Convergence custody. The Space Authority's legal team had been ready for this. They had been ready for it for years, actually. Not for this exact situation, but for some version of it, because the question of deep space salvage rights had been quietly debated in interstellar legal circles for a long time, and humanity had spent years carefully, patiently, without much fanfare, working to get its preferred version of those laws ratified by enough of the smaller independent systems to carry weight. The response to the Convergence was 17 pages long. It cited 43 separate legal precedents. It included a detailed timeline of the beacon's broadcast, the condition of the vessel, the absence of any Convergence recovery attempt, and a precise calculation of how long the ship had been drifting without any Convergence action. It was thorough and dry and completely immovable. The Convergence was furious. They sent Ambassador Vel Karn of the Sithari to deliver their displeasure in person. A tall, pale-feathered being with flat golden eyes who arrived at the Earth orbital station in a diplomatic shuttle and met with Space Authority Director Fujiwara in a conference room that had been specifically redesigned for the meeting, with chairs at 3 different heights to accommodate different body types. Vel Karn made the Convergence position clear. The ship was theirs. The salvage claim was invalid. Humanity was a young species, newly arrived on the interstellar stage, and it would be wise, very wise, to begin its participation in galactic civilization by demonstrating respect for the established order. Director Fujiwara listened to all of this with great patience. She offered Ambassador Vel Karn tea, real tea, not the synthesized kind, and waited for him to finish. Then she thanked him for coming in person, acknowledged the depth of his concerns, and explained, with equal patience, that humanity's legal position was sound, that work on the vessel would continue, and that the Earth government was always open to friendly dialogue with all members of the Convergence. Vel Karn left without the tea. Behind the diplomacy, the real work had already begun. Forge Station Tartarus was not pretty. It had gone up fast, faster than any structure of its size had ever been built in human history, which was saying something, because humans built things fast when they had reason to. It was a framework of steel and pressurized modules and docking arms that spread across 3 kilometers of space in the outer asteroid belt, designed specifically to receive, house, and work on the Sovereign. When the alien warship finally arrived and was locked into the docking framework, the two structures together looked like something that hadn't quite figured out what it was yet. The dark, sweeping lines of the alien vessel wrapped in the angular, utilitarian scaffolding of human industry. The first thing Commander Osei said when she saw it was that it looked like a broken wing being held in place while it healed. Tobias said it looked like the ugliest thing he'd ever seen. Both of them were right. The workforce that descended on Forge Station Tartarus came from everywhere. The Space Authority had put out a call, not a general public announcement, but a targeted recruitment message sent to universities and research institutions and military engineering corps and independent specialist firms, and the response had been overwhelming. Materials scientists who had spent their careers studying alien alloys from fragment samples and always dreamed of having a full hull section to work with. Xeno engineers who had built careers trying to understand convergence, drive technology from secondhand data, and now had two intact cores in front of them. Military weapons designers who came with careful expressions and signed more non-disclosure agreements than they could count, and welders, and electricians, and hull repair specialists, and logistics people, and medics, and cooks, and life support technicians, because 10,000 hands needed to eat and breathe and sleep and not die in the vacuum, and someone had to manage all of that. They worked in shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off. The station never went fully dark. There was always a shift working, always the sound of tools and the smell of welding, and the constant low hum of people doing hard things for a long time. Dr. Irina Vasquez arrived in the third week. She came on a fast transport from the Luna Military Research Complex with 2 assistants and a lot of luggage, and an expression that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this her entire career. She was 41 years old, with close-cropped dark hair and a habit of chewing on the end of her stylus when she was thinking hard, which was most of the time. Her specialization was weapon systems, alien weapon systems specifically. She had spent 15 years studying everything humanity knew about convergence military technology from a distance, reconstructing probable designs from sensor readings and diplomatic intelligence, and the occasional fragment of debris recovered from old battle sites. It was painstaking, speculative work, and she was very good at it. When she was escorted to the forward weapons bay and shown the device embedded in the hull, the long, dark thing that had been fired at the Sovereign and was now part of it, she went very still in the way that Tobias went still in front of the drive cores and Kwame went still in front of the engineering challenges. It was the stillness of recognition. "I've theorized about this," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Not this exactly, but something like this." She walked around it slowly, running her scanner in broad sweeps. "I called it the thorn in my notes. Just a name. I didn't know if it was real." She stopped and looked at it. "It's real." "Can you figure out how it works?" Dara asked. Vasquez looked at her. "Yes," she said, with the kind of flat certainty that isn't arrogance. It's just accuracy. "It will take time." "Oh, but yes." She and her team moved into the forward weapons bay and essentially didn't leave. They ate there. They slept in rotation on cots pushed into a side corridor. They spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but observation, scanning, mapping, measuring, documenting. Because Vasquez had a firm rule about touching things you didn't understand yet. You looked first. You understood the shape of a thing before you tried to understand its insides. Meanwhile, Kwame's engineering team was doing the same with the drive cores. The cracked one they set aside, it was the lowest priority because it was the most damaged and because the 2 intact ones were more than enough to work with for now. The 2 intact cores were studied with an intensity that bordered on devotion. Kwame ran a rotating team of 6 engineers in constant observation, taking readings at every frequency their instruments could manage, building a picture of how the cores worked from the outside in. What they found slowly changed things. The cores were not simply more advanced than human technology. They were differently conceived. Human drive technology was built on a foundation of controlled expansion. You pushed matter in one direction, the ship went in the other. The principles were the same ones that had launched the first rockets. The convergence drive cores operated on a different principle entirely. one that Kwame's team spent 3 weeks arguing about before they landed on a description that satisfied everyone. The cores didn't push the ship through space. They asked space to move aside and let the ship through. It wasn't magic. Why, it was physics. Just physics that humanity hadn't arrived at yet. But once they understood the principle, things started to click into place fast. The engineering team began filling entire data drives with notes and diagrams and arguments and counter-arguments. And the atmosphere in the core chamber started to feel less like a workplace and more like the best classroom any of them had ever been in. Outside the ship, the diplomatic situation had grown more complicated. 3 convergence colony worlds had gone silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from communications failure. The kind that comes from something much worse. A 4th was under siege. The information leaked through the usual unofficial channels, traders, independent news services, the quiet networks that carried information the convergence didn't officially confirm. The Nullborn were active again, more active than they'd been in a long time. The convergence did not discuss this publicly. They were proud, and being proud meant not showing damage, not admitting fear. But the silence in their official communications became noticeable in its own way. A careful silence, a silence that had effort in it. On Forge Station Tartarus, the work continued. The hull plating was the project that produced the most excitement in the material science team, and the material science team was already an excited group. The samples they took from the Sovereign's outer hull, tiny cores drilled from sections that were already damaged so as not to weaken anything structural, went through every analysis the team could devise. The alloy was not something humanity could have produced with current technology. The grain structure of the metal was arranged in patterns that didn't occur naturally and had never been achieved in a human laboratory. The result was a material that handled stress in an entirely different way than anything human-made. When you hit normal armor plating, the force concentrated at the point of impact. The metal deformed, cracked, failed at that point. The Sovereign's hull plating distributed impact force laterally. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough to make a dramatic difference. A hit that would punch through standard plating simply spread its energy across a wider area and became a dent instead of a hole. Dr. Lena Park, the lead materials scientist, was the one who figured out that the distribution pattern wasn't random. And it was geometric, a specific mathematical arrangement built into the metal itself at the molecular level. Once she understood the pattern, she realized something else. You could improve it. The convergence design was good, but it had a flaw. The distribution geometry worked well for direct impacts, but was less effective against glancing hits at specific angles. Park's team designed a variation, a new arrangement they called the reactive mesh, that eliminated the flaw. It could not be manufactured from the same alien alloy. They couldn't make that alloy yet, but it could be applied as a secondary layer over the existing hull plating. It made the already extraordinary hull of the Sovereign significantly more resistant to damage. Park sent her proposal to Kwame. Kwame sent it to Director Fujiwara. Fujiwara approved it in 24 hours. They began applying the reactive mesh to the hull in the 6th month of work. By then, the station had settled into a rhythm. Not a comfortable rhythm. There was too much urgency for comfort, but a sustainable one. People knew their jobs. Teams knew each other. The dark interior of the Sovereign was no longer strange and frightening, but familiar. Walked through, understood. Engineers had named corridors. The forward weapons bay where Vasquez worked was called the Thorn Room. The core chamber was called the Heart. The vast empty space of the main hangar bay, which could hold 12 human fighters with room for more, was called the Barn. In the Thorn Room, Vasquez made her breakthrough in month 4. She had been working backward from the device's effects, analyzing the damage patterns on the Sovereign's hull, trying to understand what the weapon had done in order to understand how it had done it. The damage was not kinetic. It was not energy in the conventional sense. The best description she could develop was that the weapon had temporarily disrupted the structural cohesion of whatever it hit. Not destroying matter, but convincing matter briefly to stop being coherent. The metal of the hull hadn't been torn or burned. It had, for a fraction of a second, simply forgotten how to be metal. And in that fraction of a second, whatever followed had passed through easily. It's a coherence disruptor, she told Dara, standing in the throne room with data tablets spread around her on every flat surface. Targeted, precise, high power, fired at the Sovereign's main drive housing. She pointed to the corresponding location on a schematic. One shot. The housing stopped being coherent for 0.003 seconds. Everything connected to it failed at once. Dara looked at the schematic. Can we fire it? Vasquez looked at the device, at the wires and tubing trailing from its back end, at the power feeds that connected to systems she now understood. Not yet, she said. The power coupling is designed for convergent systems. We'd need to adapt it. She paused. But yes, eventually, we can fire it. The news of Vasquez's progress spread through the station like warmth. People who had never been in the throne room found reasons to walk past it. The atmosphere on Forge Station Tartarus, which had always been purposeful, became something else. Something more charged, more electric, the way the air feels before a storm. In month 8, the lights of the Sovereign came back on. It happened at 3 in the morning, station time. Kwame's team had been working for 36 hours straight. They'd been close. They could feel it, and nobody had wanted to stop. And when the power finally cycled through the repaired conduits and the ship's main lighting grid activated, it happened all at once. Every corridor, every bay, every compartment at the same moment. The crew of Forge Station Tartarus woke to the sound of people shouting in the corridors. Not in alarm, but in something closer to joy. People ran to viewports. The alien ship, which had been dark for so long that dark had started to feel like its natural state, was lit from within. Warm amber light pouring from its windows, so golden against the black. Kwame came and found Dara in the observation bay, where she was standing at the viewport watching the ship with her arms folded across her chest and an expression he couldn't quite read. She's awake, he said. Dara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful, the way it gets when you're feeling something large and you don't want to spill it. What do we call her? She asked. Kwame thought about it. They'd all been calling it the Sovereign, which was its convergence name, but that didn't seem right anymore. It wasn't the Sovereign now. It was something different, something new, built on old bones. Prometheus, he said. The name had been floating around informally among the engineering team for weeks. It fit. The myth of it fit. The creature who brought fire down from the gods, who gave to ordinary hands what had been held only by extraordinary ones. Dara nodded. The ECV Prometheus, she said. Earth Command Vessel, the first of its kind. Log it. Somewhere deep in the station's communication systems, an automated log entry was created. It recorded the time, the date, the name, and the commander. It was a small entry. It did not look, in that moment, like the beginning of something that would change the balance of everything. But it was. The Prometheus had bones. Good bones, extraordinary bones, built by master engineers from a civilization that had been traveling the stars for 300 years before humanity's ancestors had figured out agriculture. Nobody on Forge Station Tartarus forgot that. The respect was real. But respect for humans did not mean leaving things the way they found them. The decision had been made early. Not in a formal meeting, not in a memo or an official directive, but in the quiet way that big decisions often actually get made, through 100 small conversations between people who all arrived at the same conclusion independently. The Prometheus would not simply be repaired. Repairing it would mean returning it to what it had been before. A warship that the Convergence had decided was not worth saving. That had been their judgment. Humanity was not interested in confirming their judgment. The Prometheus would be rebuilt, and in the rebuilding, it would become something the Convergence had never imagined. The first major change was the internal layout. The original ship had 7 decks dedicated to ceremonial and administrative functions, spaces designed for formal meetings, for the display of Sithari military honors, for the specific social rituals that Convergence crews observed during long voyages. These were not small spaces. They were carefully designed and beautifully detailed, with carved walls and specific lighting and raised platforms arranged for precise social hierarchies. Kwame's team converted them to ammunition storage, equipment bays, and secondary engineering workshops. The decision was not made with contempt. The carved walls were photographed, documented, cataloged with care before the conversion began. Dr. Solis spent 2 weeks recording every detail of the ceremonial spaces before they changed. But when documentation was complete, the spaces became what the Prometheus needed them to be. The logic was simple. Every square meter of unused space was a resource. Resources did not get wasted. The command system was the next major overhaul, and it was the one that generated the most argument. The original Sovereign had been commanded by a single AI architecture, one central control intelligence, hierarchically organized, with all command decisions flowing through a single decision point. This was standard convergence design doctrine. It was efficient. It was orderly. It ensured that no conflicting commands could be issued simultaneously, that the ship could not contradict itself, that control was always clear and traceable. It was also, from a human military engineering perspective, a single point of failure. The proposal to replace it came from a young systems engineer named Dr. Yusuf Anand, who had arrived at Forge Station Tartarus 6 months into the project with a reputation for brilliant ideas and a habit of staying awake much longer than was good for him. He presented his alternative to Kwame in a meeting that was supposed to last 30 minutes and lasted 4 hours. Anand's idea was a distributed neural network pilot interface, not one AI but 12 human pilots, each connected through a neural link interface to the ship's control systems, each feeding constant data to the others in real time. Not full mental merging, nothing that invasive or experimental, but a high-speed sharing of sensory and tactical data that would allow 12 human minds to collectively process the ship's status and environment far faster than any single intelligence could. The Convergence had never done anything like this. The prevailing wisdom in convergence engineering circles was that biological minds couldn't sustain that kind of linked operation at the speeds required for combat, that the data would overwhelm the organic processors, that the inputs would conflict, that the system would fail catastrophically. Anand thought they were wrong. He had data. He had models. He had 3 years of research from a program at the Luna Neurological Institute that the Space Authority had been quietly funding for exactly this kind of application. Kwame read the proposal, looked at the data, and took it to Fujiwara. Fujiwara read it for a very long time. Then she approved it. If it doesn't work, she told Kwame afterward, we'll find out in testing before it matters. It worked. The first full test of the distributed pilot interface happened in month 12, with 12 volunteers who had been selected and trained for 9 months, running simulated combat scenarios in the Prometheus's command center. The initial runs were rough. The data sharing produced headaches, disorientation, occasional nausea, a lot of swearing. The pilots described it as trying to think while someone else's thoughts were running through the same space at the same time. But humans adapted. That was the thing about humans. They adapted to things that should have broken them, found the edges of discomfort and learned to function there, and then pushed the edge a little further. By the 20th test run, the pilot team was executing maneuvers in simulation that no single AI system had ever managed. The Prometheus, in simulation, moved like something alive. The drive core breakthrough came from Anand as well, and though this one was almost accidental. He had been studying the limiters built into the core control systems, the software constraints that kept the cores operating below their theoretical maximum output. The convergence engineers who had built them had set the upper limit at 60%, standard practice. Drive cores run hot, you leave margin for safety, you don't push beyond the tested range. Anand found the limiters. He mapped them. He then did something that a convergence engineer might have found alarming. He asked why. Not why limiters existed in general, that was obvious, but why these specific limiters were set at this specific level. He went looking for the original engineering documentation, piecing it together from the fragments of the ship's data systems that Dr. Solis's team had managed to recover and translate. What he found surprised him. The 60% limit was not an engineering limit. It was a safety preference limit. The original convergence engineers had tested the cores to 78% of maximum output during initial trials. At 78%, the system produced more heat than the cooling infrastructure could handle comfortably. The engineers had written a note in their documentation. He had to have Solus translate it 3 times to be sure he was reading it correctly. That essentially said, "This is uncomfortable to manage, so we will set the limit lower." They had not said the cores were dangerous above 60%. They had said they were inconvenient. Anand took this finding to the engineering team. There was a heated discussion. Some engineers were conservative. You don't push alien technology past its design parameters without a very good reason and very careful testing. Others were less conservative. The discussion lasted 3 days. In the end, they tested it, carefully, in stages, with every monitoring system they had running at full capacity and with the station's emergency protocols on standby. At 65%, everything was fine. At 70%, the cooling infrastructure worked harder but managed. At 78%, the point where the convergence engineers had felt uncomfortable, the system was warm but stable. At 85%, some secondary systems needed adjustment. They made the adjustments. At 94%, the cores were running at a level that would have been considered impossible by convergence standards. The output was extraordinary. The Prometheus's potential speed, already beyond anything human-built, increased by a factor that made the navigation team fall silent when they ran the numbers, because the numbers looked wrong even though they were right. The limiters were fear, Anand told Dara, the night they confirmed the 94% result. He didn't say it with contempt. He said it was something more like understanding. They got uncomfortable and they stopped. They drew a line at uncomfortable and called it a limit. Dara thought about that for a while. "We do that too," she said. "Yes," Anand agreed. "But then we come back." The reactive mesh application was completed in month 14. Dr. Upark's team had developed a process for applying the secondary layer without compromising the alien hull's own properties, and they worked their way across the entire outer surface of the Prometheus in sections over 6 weeks. When they were done, the ship had a hull that was, by their calculations, 38% more resistant to kinetic and energy weapons than the original design, and the original design had already been extraordinary. In the Thorn Room, Vasquez was ready. The power coupling adaptation had taken her team 8 months. 8 months of patient, careful, meticulous work, because the Thorn was the piece she would not rush. She had her engineers fabricate new coupling components, bridge systems between human power infrastructure and the alien device's original feeds. It could test the connections at progressively higher power levels until she was certain. The original weapon had drawn power from convergence systems. Now it drew power from human systems. The translation was not perfect. There was a small efficiency loss, but it worked. They fired the Thorn for the first time in a weapons test chamber, aimed at a section of standard military-grade armor plating at a range of 200 meters. The armor plating ceased to exist as coherent armor plating for 0.003 seconds. In that time, the test round that followed hit it as though it were air. On the other side of the test chamber, the sensors recorded an impact that should have been impossible. The round had gone straight through plating that it had no right to penetrate. Vasquez's team looked at the results. Then they looked at each other. And then they looked at the results again. "Log it," Vasquez said quietly, the same way Dara had said it when the lights came on. The word that spread through Forge Station Tartarus after the weapons test was different from the warm excitement that had followed the lights coming on. It was quieter, heavier. People understood, for the first time with full weight, exactly what was being built in their space dock. This was not a museum piece. This was not a trophy. This was a weapon, a true weapon, something with real teeth, something that had been broken by the Nullborn and was now coming back stronger than before, wearing human hands. The formal weapons performance evaluation was conducted in month 17, with military observers present from 4 different Earth nations in the Space Authority's High Command. The Prometheus ran through its paces in a controlled deep space testing zone. Speed tests, maneuverability tests, weapons tests across all systems including the Thorn, hull resistance tests using controlled impacts at various energy levels. The final numbers were sent to Director Fujiwara in a report that she read alone in her office with the door locked. The Prometheus outperformed the Varketh Sovereign's original specifications by a factor of 3. 3 times faster, 3 times better protected. Weapon systems that were entirely original, plus one that the Nullborn themselves had built, and that now answered to human command. A crew interface that no convergence ship could match for speed or adaptability. And somewhere inside all of it, 12 human pilots who had learned over 17 months of training, honored to think together in ways that surprised even the researchers who had designed the system. Fujiwara sent the report to the Senior Space Authority Council. She included a one-line cover note. It read, "We are ready. The question is what we are ready for." The Convergence had been watching with increasing unease through their diplomatic intelligence networks and their long-range sensors. They had expected, most of their analysts had expected, that humanity would tinker with the ship, repair some of the damage, perhaps manage to restart one of the drive cores, declare victory, and call it a trophy. That was what a young species did with something it didn't fully understand. That was the pattern the Convergence had seen before. The reports coming back from their observers were not describing a trophy. To High Warden Dross of the Kalan, one of the most senior military voices on the Convergence Council, convened a closed-door meeting with 6 other council members. The meeting lasted 12 hours. The transcript that eventually leaked to human intelligence networks showed a council that was frightened, though it took careful reading between the lines to see it, because Convergence Council members did not say frightened directly. They said concern. They said significant development. They said recalibration of strategic assumptions may be required. And one line, attributed to Dross himself, that was unambiguous. We gave them a wound. They made it a weapon. What the Convergence did not say in that meeting, what they could not yet bring themselves to say, was that they needed help, because the Nullborn had gone silent. 4 colony worlds were dead. A 5th had been warned. The Convergence's own warships had engaged Nullborn forces twice in the past 3 months and been damaged both times. They were too proud to ask. On Forge Station Tartarus, Dara Ose stood on the deck of the Prometheus. Her deck now, because the Space Authority had officially given her command 3 weeks ago, and walked the length of the main corridor from bow to stern and tried to understand what she was in charge of. She had commanded salvage vessels for 15 years. She knew every sound a ship made, every smell, every vibration that meant something needed checking, and every vibration that was just the normal complaint of metal under stress. The Tenacious had been an old friend. Familiar, honest, reliable. The Prometheus was not old and familiar. It was extraordinary and slightly terrifying, and she was responsible for it, and for the crew that would sail it, and for whatever it would do when it sailed. She stood at the forward viewport and looked out at the asteroid belt and thought about broken things, about the beacon still on record somewhere, still containing its cold message, condemned, contaminated, do not approach, and about all the things that message had gotten wrong, not contaminated, not condemned, just waiting. She thought about where they would go. The Convergence was hurting, the Nullborn were moving, the galaxy was changing, and humanity was standing at the edge of it with the most powerful ship it had ever possessed and a crew that had spent 17 months becoming something new. She turned away from the viewport. There was work to do. And the call from the Convergence did not come from the Council. It never did with things like this. It came through a back channel. A message passed through 3 independent relay stations, arriving at Earth's Deep Space Communications Hub, wrapped in civilian encryption that was thin enough to be recognizable as deliberately thin. It was meant to be found. It was meant to look like it had been found accidentally. The message was addressed to no one in particular. It described in careful, indirect language a situation in the Kareth system, a strategic hub with 2 inhabited worlds and a major communications relay, positioned at a point in space that the Convergence called the Deep. It described Nullborn fleet movements. It described the scale of the threat. It described the current status of Convergence forces in the region, with a specificity that could only have come from someone with access to Convergence military intelligence. It did not ask for help. The Convergence did not ask for help. But the information was precise, and the implication was clear. Director Fujiwara received the message in the early morning and spent 2 hours in conference with the Space Authority High Command. Then she called Dara. The conversation was short. Dara listened. She asked 3 questions. Fujiwara answered them. There was a pause. The Prometheus hasn't been in actual combat, Dara said. No, Fujiwara agreed. The pilot interface has only run in simulation. Yes. Another pause. The Convergence didn't ask. They didn't, Fujiwara said. They won't. Swat, you know that. Dara was quiet for a long moment. She was standing in the Prometheus's command center, a space that her crew had quietly redesigned from the Convergence original, keeping the bones of the layout, but rearranging the stations, adding the neural link chairs in a circle at the center, replacing the single commanding throne with a practical command platform that put the senior officer in the middle of the information rather than above it. Kareth Deep, she said. Kareth Deep, Fujiwara confirmed. We'll need transit time. 31 hours at safe FTL. Take 22, Fujiwara said. Don't be safe. The Prometheus left Forge Station Tartarus 14 hours later. The departure was not ceremonial. There was no crowd, no speech, no music. The docking clamps released, the thrusters engaged. Shepard and the ship moved, slowly at first, then faster still, until the asteroid belt was behind it and the dark between stars was ahead. In the command center, the 12 pilots settled into their neural link chairs. The interfaces engaged one by one, each pilot feeling the familiar disorientation as the data sharing system came online. 12 sets of perceptions briefly overlapping, 12 minds finding the rhythm of thinking together. The headaches had never fully gone away. Everyone had learned to work through them. Dara stood at her command platform and watched her crew work and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. They knew what they were going into. They were ready, or they would find out they weren't, and either way, the only direction was forward. Anon brought the cores to 94%. The Prometheus went to FTL. The Convergence fleet at Kareth Deep was 17 warships strong, a significant force by any normal measure, assembled with genuine urgency, commanded by Admiral Vor Heth of the Sethari, a veteran of 40 years of Convergence military service. He was not a careless commander. He had assessed the situation, planned his engagement, positioned his ships well. The Nullborn arrived in 31 vessels. They did not arrive in formation. They did not arrive with any pattern that the Convergence tactical system could predict or categorize. They dropped out of whatever mode of travel they used. It was not FTL in any sense the Convergence recognized. In multiple points simultaneously, surrounding the defensive perimeter before it could fully form. And the first exchange of fire lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, 3 Convergence warships were destroyed and 4 more were heavily damaged. The Nullborn had lost 2 ships, not destroyed, but driven back, their hulls scored by concentrated rail cannon fire. Vor Heth reorganized. He was good at reorganizing under fire. He had done it before. He brought his remaining ships into a tighter formation, concentrated their fire, and prepared for the second engagement. The second engagement lasted 22 minutes. 2 more Convergence ships died. The Nullborn pressed inward. They were patient, inhumanly, anythingly patient, in a way that was its own kind of horror. They did not rush. They did not seem to feel urgency. They simply advanced, absorbed fire, returned fire, and advanced again, as if they had already calculated the end of the battle and were simply working through the steps. Vor Heth's tactical officer told him, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, that their current rate of attrition would result in total fleet loss in approximately 4 hours. Vor Heth acknowledged this. He began drafting an evacuation recommendation for the inhabited worlds below. He did not stop fighting while he drafted it. He was not the kind of man who stopped fighting. That was when the Prometheus came out of FTL. It came in fast, faster than any ship of its size had any right to move, dropping out of transit at the edge of the engagement zone and immediately rolling into a hard bank that should have been impossible for a vessel 3 kilometers long. The 12 pilots were thinking together. And what they collectively decided the ship should do, the ship did, because 12 minds processing the same data found solutions faster than one. Admiral Vor Heth's tactical display suddenly acquired a new contact. His tactical officer stared at it for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in the middle of an active battle was a long time to stare at anything, and said, "Admiral, that's the ship, the human ship, the Prometheus." Vorheth looked at its size, at its speed, at the way it was moving. "Open all frequencies," he said. The Prometheus was already broadcasting. Not a message, not yet, just a signal, a presence, a declaration that it was here and it was not stopping. Dara's voice went out on all frequencies, Convergence and Nullborn both. She did not make a speech. She did not warn the Nullborn or give them a chance to retreat. Speeches were for after. She simply said 3 words to her crew in a calm, clear voice that the recording systems would preserve perfectly. "Vasquez, the Thorn," and then the battle began. The Convergence historian Sarah Moth, who had been aboard Vorheth's flagship to document what was expected to be a significant but ultimately contained military engagement, later wrote the only account of what followed from a Convergence perspective. The account was read widely, translated into every Convergence language, and debated by military analysts for years. She wrote, "I have spent my career studying battle. I have read accounts of 1,000 engagements across 3 centuries of Convergence history. I have a framework for understanding war, the movements of ships, the logic of tactical decisions, the calculus of force against force. The Prometheus did not fight within my framework. It fought in ways I did not have language for, and I have spent 20 years since trying to develop that language. I am not certain I have succeeded. What the Prometheus did was this. It did not engage the Nullborn the way the Convergence engaged them. The Convergence fought by established doctrine, formations, coordinated fire, predictable approach vectors, the accumulated tactical wisdom of 300 years. It was good doctrine. It had won many battles. The Nullborn had learned it. They had fought the Convergence many times. They knew the patterns. Their patience was partly the patience of something that had studied its enemy and knew how long each move would take. The Prometheus had no doctrine. Or rather, it had human doctrine, which was a different thing entirely, because human military history was a long, complicated, often brutal argument between people who thought you should follow the rules and people who thought the rules were just what your enemy expected. The Prometheus had been designed and crewed by people who had grown up in that argument and had a strong opinion about which side was right. The 12 pilots moved the ship the way their linked minds collectively decided it should move, not according to a plan, but according to the situation as it was changing in real time. When a Nullborn vessel moved to a flank position, the Prometheus was already responding before the movement was complete, because 12 minds processing the same sensor data found the pattern half a second before a single mind would have. However, half a second in a battle between ships moving at fractions of light speed was significant. The Thorn fired twice in the first 6 minutes. The first shot struck a Nullborn vessel at the junction of its drive system and its weapons array. The vessel's drive coherence failed for 0.003 seconds. In that 0.003 seconds, the rail cannon broadside that the Prometheus had already positioned and timed hit the Nullborn ship as if its hull were open air. The ship did not explode. It simply stopped working, all at once, completely, in the way of something that has had its fundamental organization disrupted. It drifted. The Nullborn did not attempt to recover it. The second shot was more complex. Vasquez had been watching the Nullborn fleet's communication patterns, the subtle signals that moved between their ships, with a coordination that made them move together. She had identified what she believed was a relay vessel, a ship whose primary function was not combat but communication, keeping the fleet coordinated. She could not be certain. She had 2 minutes to decide. She fired. The relay vessel's communication systems failed for 0.003 seconds. The Nullborn fleet hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely measurable in standard time, but it was visible on the tactical display as a fractional pause in their movement patterns, a beat of disorganization in the previously fluid collective action. The 12 pilots saw it immediately. They moved the Prometheus into the gap. What followed in the next 40 minutes was something that Sarah Moth wrote she could not fully describe, but would attempt to convey. The human ship did not fight cleanly. It fought the way water fights. It found every weakness, every gap, every moment of disorganization, and it went there. It did not hold a position. It was never where the Nullborn expected it to be. It was fast in ways that its size made impossible, and aggressive in ways that its position made impractical. And yet it was both those things simultaneously. The remaining convergence vessels, under Vorheth's command, did something smart. They stopped trying to fight alongside the Prometheus and instead watched where it was not. The Prometheus was drawing Nullborn attention like a sun draws light. Vorheth moved his ships to the edges of that attention and picked off Nullborn vessels that were focused elsewhere. It was the first time in the battle that the Convergence fleet had been able to choose where they wanted to be. The Nullborn endured for another hour and 10 minutes. They adapted. They always adapted, always found adjustments to new situations, always surprised their enemies with responses that had not been anticipated. They found counter moves to the Prometheus's speed. They found angles that the pilot interface took longer to process. They concentrated fire in ways that tested even the reactive mesh hull. Twice the Prometheus took significant hits. Sections of the outer hull deformed. The reactive mesh absorbed most of the energy, but most was not all, and there was damage. Dara felt it through the ship the way you feel a blow through a vehicle. Distant, translated, but real. She did not change course. The Nullborn had never retreated. That was in every piece of intelligence humanity had gathered about them. They fought until they won or until they were destroyed, and they had never been seen to do otherwise. The Convergence's experience of them was of an implacable advance that only fire and sacrifice could slow. The Nullborn retreated. They did not leave all at once. 3 vessels went first, simply turned and accelerated away from the engagement zone at maximum speed. Then 6 more followed. Then the rest, in a broken, uncoordinated flight that looked nothing like their previous discipline, because whatever system had kept them coordinated was damaged and they were each acting alone for the first time. The Battle of Kareth Deep ended. The inhabited worlds below were safe. The relay station was intact. The Convergence fleet, what remained of it, was battered and damaged and alive. In his log, written several hours later, when his hands had stopped shaking, Admiral Vorheth of the Sithari recorded his official account of the engagement. He was precise and professional and accurate in every detail. At the end of the official record, he added a personal note that was not required and that he knew would be read by future historians. I have seen war for 60 years. I have seen the Kalan campaigns and the border engagements and the long battle at Cythera Station that we do not speak of in polite company. I have seen courage and strategy and sacrifice. I do not know what I saw today. I do not know if it was courage, because courage implies risk accepted, and I am not certain the humans perceive the risk the way we would. Only I do not know if it was strategy, because strategy implies a plan, and I am not certain they were following one in any sense I recognize. I know that they came when they did not have to. I know that the Nullborn, who have never retreated, retreated. I know that when I look at the tactical recording of that battle, I see something I cannot fully explain. I do not know whether to be grateful or terrified. I suspect I should be both. Dara sat in the command center after the battle when the FTL was engaged and Kareth Deep was falling behind them, and let herself be tired. It was a deep tiredness, the kind that comes not from effort alone, but from having been completely present for something enormous. Her crew was quiet. The pilots had disengaged from the interface, and most of them had the hollow, we wrung out look they always had after a long linked session. Vasquez was in the Thorn room, running diagnostics because Vasquez always ran diagnostics after firing. Anand was in the heart because the cores had pushed hard and he would not rest until he had checked every system himself. Tobias brought Dara a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the synthesized kind, from a small personal supply he had been hoarding since before they left Forge Station. He put it in her hand without saying anything. She drank it. It was the best thing she had tasted in a long time. They retreated, Tobias said eventually. They retreated, she agreed. Nobody's ever made them retreat. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Are you worried about what that means for them? What they do next? Dara thought about it. The Nullborn had retreated. They were still out there. They would adapt. That was what they did. Whatever they had learned today, they would incorporate. They would come back differently. Yes, she said. I'm worried about it. But she wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and looked at the forward viewport. at the stars moving past in the long, silver streaks of FTL transit. "But we'll be ready," she said. "That's what we do." The invitation arrived 48 hours after the Prometheus returned to Forge Station Tartarus. It was not phrased as an invitation because the Convergence Council did not phrase things as invitations when they felt they were doing someone a favor. It was phrased as a summons, a formal request for a representative of humanity to appear before the full Convergence Council at the station of Elkarn to discuss the events at Kareth Deep and their broader implications for the ongoing Nullborn crisis. The word crisis was new. The Convergence had been calling it a situation in all previous official communications. Crisis meant something had changed, not just in the facts of the matter, but in how the Convergence was willing to speak about it. Director Fujiwara read the message 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Dara with a single sentence attached. "You should be the one to go." Dara forwarded it to Tobias with a single sentence attached. "I'm going to need clean clothes." The meeting was held in the Convergence diplomatic station above the neutral world of Ether 6, a world that nobody particularly owned and everybody occasionally agreed to meet on, which was the best kind of neutral ground. And the station was enormous and formal and very beautiful in the Sithari style, all flowing lines and carved surfaces, and the kind of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The council chamber held representatives from all 7 convergent species. They sat in a curved arrangement, a very precise curved arrangement, every position calculated to express the exact degree of status and relationship that existed between each species. The Sithari sat highest because it was a Sithari station. The Kalan sat beside them. The remaining 5 species occupied positions that communicated, to anyone who knew how to read it, the entire complex social architecture of convergent civilization. There was one additional chair. It had been placed at the floor of the chamber, lower than every convergence representative, in which was the position traditionally occupied by species that had not yet been granted full standing. It was a small, deliberate signal. The convergence was offering humanity a seat. They were also communicating what kind of seat it was. Dara walked into the chamber alone. She had been offered an escort and had declined. She was wearing her command uniform, the Space Authority's dark blue, simple, well-made, entirely without the kind of elaborate decoration that Convergence military dress tended to favor. She looked around the chamber once, taking in the architecture, the faces, the arrangement of seats. She walked to the empty chair and looked at it. Then she pulled it out from the table, turned it 90 degrees, and sat down sideways to the table. Not lower than the council, not higher, but level with the middle tier. On her back to no one, her face turned so she could see the full arc of the chamber. It was a small thing, but the chamber went quiet in a way that wasn't the quiet of a meeting beginning. It was the quiet of people noticing something. High Warden Dross of the Kalan, who had spoken the words "we gave them a wound," they made it a weapon, sat at the left end of the arc. He was very old by Kalan standards, his hide a deep, weathered gray, his eyes the amber of old things that had seen a great deal. He watched Dara move the chair and settle into it, and something in his expression shifted, something that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but lived in the territory between them. The senior Sithari council member, Archwarden Velso, it opened the meeting in the formal manner. A recitation of names and titles and the occasion for the gathering that took 4 minutes and would have taken longer if anyone had been less pressed for time. Then he looked at Dara. "Commander Osei," he said, in translated human speech. The translation was very good. The diplomatic staff had been using translation systems for longer than humanity had been spacefaring. "The Convergence thanks you for your assistance at Kareth Deep." Dara waited. Velso continued. "The Convergence would like to offer humanity full membership in the Galactic Convergence. This would grant humanity equal access to Convergence trade routes, communication networks, and the collective security structure." "Thank you," Dara said. Velso paused at the interruption. Interrupting a council member mid-address was unusual. "Then you accept—" "I said thank you," Dara said. "I didn't say I accept." The chamber was very quiet. She had come prepared. Not just emotionally prepared, not just psychologically ready, but specifically practically prepared. 17 people back on Earth had been working for 3 weeks on what she was about to say. Not writing her words, Dara was not the kind of person who delivered other people's words, but building the architecture of an argument, sourcing every claim, anticipating every counter, making sure that what she brought into this chamber was not just principle, but fact. She took out a small device and set it on the table. It projected a document into the shared holographic display space, a document visible to every member of the council. Humanity is grateful for the offer, she said. A seat at the table is something we understand the value of, but a seat at the bottom of the table, as the newest and therefore smallest voice in a structure that has not changed its fundamental organization in 300 years, we'd like to suggest that now is a good time to think about structural change. Velso said very carefully, "What kind of change?" "The tiered species hierarchy," Dara said. "It ends. Full equality of standing for all member species, not a hierarchy based on when a species first achieved FTL travel. The species that got to the stars first didn't necessarily get there because they were better. They got there because the circumstances of their world permitted it sooner. We don't think that should be the basis for permanent inequality." She let that sit for a moment. Then she continued, "Open salvage rights across convergence space with a fair process for disputed claims. Not the current system, where the most powerful convergence member almost always prevails. Technology sharing mandates for any advancement that has a direct bearing on collective security, specifically anything relevant to the nullborn. A shared intelligence network that actually shares, rather than the current system where information is rationed by political relationship." High Warden Dross had been very still throughout this. Now he spoke, and his voice, even through the translation, carried the texture of age and precision. "You are describing the dismantling of the structure that has maintained order in this region of space for 3 centuries. "I'm describing its reform," Dara said. "There's a difference." She looked at him directly. "The structure that has maintained order for 3 centuries just spent the last 4 years losing colony worlds to the nullborn. I say this with respect. The structure is not as strong as it has believed itself to be. And the reason a salvage crew from a species you considered primitive boarded an abandoned convergence warship and turned it into something that drove off the nullborn. The reason for that is the same reason we're sitting here having this conversation instead of a different one. The structure underestimated us. It underestimated what happens when you leave something within reach of people who are good at fixing things." The chamber was quiet for a long time. Velso and Dross exchanged a look that Dara could not fully read, but understood was significant. "These are not simple changes," Velso said. "No," Dara agreed. "They aren't. Discussions of this nature take years." "Then we should start today," Dara said. "We have a common enemy and a shared interest. That's the best possible moment to reform a structure, when everyone at the table has a reason to want the same thing." She picked up her device, closed the document projection, and folded her hands on the table. She had said what she had come to say. The rest was theirs to decide. The negotiations took 11 months. They were not smooth. There were arguments that lasted days, positions that seemed immovable until they moved, moments when the whole process seemed to be collapsing and then somehow didn't. 3 species on the council resisted the equality mandate fiercely. 2 supported it from the beginning. The Sithari, the most senior, the most proud, said almost nothing for the first 3 months. And then in a session that Dara described later as the most surprising 4 hours of her life, Archwarden Velso delivered a statement supporting full structural reform, citing Admiral Vorheth's account of the Battle of Kareth Deep as the basis for his position. He quoted the last line of Vorheth's log. "I do not know whether to be grateful or terrified. I suspect I should be both. If our finest military mind with 60 years of experience cannot categorize what humanity did at Kareth Deep," Velso said, "then our current framework for understanding the relationship between species is insufficient. A framework that cannot account for what we have seen is a framework that needs revision." It was not a ringing endorsement of human equality. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement that the world had changed. But pragmatic acknowledgement from the Sithari was worth more than passionate endorsement from a lesser member. and the negotiations shifted after that day. The final accord, called the Ether 6 Accord, for where it was signed, established full species equality within the convergence structure, created a shared intelligence council with mandatory participation, instituted open salvage rights with an independent arbitration process, and mandated military technology sharing for any advancement with direct relevance to collective defense. It also established a joint nullborn response force, not a convergence force with human support, but a genuinely joint command where Earth held equal decision-making authority. Dara signed it on behalf of Earth with a pen, a real physical pen, because she had a weakness for old things, and the Convergence's signing ceremonies used light projection systems that left no physical mark. She brought her own pen. She signed her name in ink on a page that would go into the Convergence's most formal archive, alongside light print signatures from 7 other species. Nobody commented on the pen. She thought she saw Dross almost smile. The Prometheus returned to Forge Station Tartarus after the signing, where Kwame's team immediately began the repairs to the hull damage sustained at Kareth Deep, or 2 sections of the outer plating needed replacement, and 3 internal systems had been stressed beyond their design tolerances by the push to 94% during the battle. It was not catastrophic damage. The reactive mesh had done its job, and the cores had held. But it needed fixing, and the team fixed it with the same intensity they had brought to every previous task. Vasquez used the downtime to run a full diagnostic on the Thorn and came back with a report that made her sit in the Thorn room alone for an hour before she showed it to anyone. The weapon had performed beyond its original specifications. Every efficiency metric was better than her pre-battle models had predicted. She didn't know exactly why. The data suggested that the adapted human power coupling was delivering energy to the device in a slightly different pattern than the original convergence feed had, and that pattern was, apparently, more effective. She wrote the finding up carefully and sent it to the engineering team with a note that said, "Sometimes the translation improves the original." Further study required. Dr. Solis, the xenologist who had been cataloging the carved walls of the ceremonial deck since the beginning of the project, published her documentation as a formal academic paper, a detailed record of Sithari military aesthetic tradition, including photographs of every relief and every symbol, preserved permanently even though the spaces themselves had been converted to storage bays. Well, the paper was well received in xenocultural circles. The Sithari diplomatic office sent a brief, formal acknowledgement. She suspected it had meant more to them than the brevity suggested. Anand went back to studying the drive cores. There were things he still didn't understand about them. Specifically, the question of whether 94% was actually the limit, or whether the convergence engineers had simply not been willing to go further. He had a theory. He was not yet ready to test it. He was being careful, because careful was what you were when you were dealing with something that contained that much power and that much potential. And because Dara had made him promise to talk to the full engineering team before he ran any new tests, and he intended to keep that promise. He was going to keep it for at least another few months. Tobias, who had once described Forge Station Tartarus as the ugliest thing he had ever seen, had quietly started calling it home. He had a cabin here, a workshop, and a small window that looked out at the Prometheus. Sometimes in the early morning station time, when most of the crew was sleeping and the station was at its quietest, he sat by that window with a coffee and watched the ship. He had been a salvager for 20 years. He had spent those years finding things that were broken and getting them to the people who could fix them. He had never before this been one of the people who did the fixing. Not at this level, not for something this significant. He thought about that sometimes, about the accident of being in the right place, at the right time, and with the right skills and what it had led to, about the scan that had pinged on a Tuesday and shown a mass that didn't make sense, about Dara leaning forward in the pilot chair of the Tenacious and saying, "We're going to look." In the Convergence's primary historical archive on the Sithari homeworld, there was a collection of artifacts from significant moments in Convergence history: battle flags, treaty documents, the original mapping charts of the first FTL explorers, things that had been kept because they were important, because they were the physical record of moments that had changed what followed. 6 months after the signing of the Ether 6 Accord, A new addition was made to the collection. It was not a convergence artifact. It was a human object, a metal disc about the size of a human palm, hand engraved with a star map of the Sol system on one side and the words ISV tenacious on the other. Dara had found it in her pocket when she was packing up her quarters on the old salvage ship, before she officially transferred her command. She had kept it for years as the kind of small, insignificant thing you carry without thinking about, the way sailors carried tokens of ships they loved. She had left it with the Convergence archivist at the end of the negotiations, without much ceremony, because she didn't want to make a production of it, but she thought there should be something physical in the record. Something that said, this is where it started. The archivist, an ancient, meticulous Kalan named Vel Oros, who had been cataloging Convergence history for longer than most current council members had been alive, placed it in the case beside the other artifacts. She wrote its entry herself in the precise formal language that the archive used for all its records. Under its entry, the museum also displayed a physical copy of the original engineering report on the Varketh Sovereign, the Convergence assessment that had declared the ship unsalvageable, the report that had been wrong in every important way. Below the report, Veloros had written the placard herself. The archivist was not, by nature, a person who wrote dramatic things. She was precise. She was measured. She had seen a great deal of history and was not easily moved to strong statements. But she had read Vorheth's log, and she had read Sarah Moth's account of the battle. And she had been present, quietly, in the back of the chamber, for every session of the Ether 6 negotiations. She had watched Dara move a chair and sit sideways at a table that had been arranged to tell her where she belonged, and she had thought about it for 11 months, and when she sat down to write the placard, she knew what it should say. It read, Filed, 2185. Human salvage of vessel commenced, 2187. Vessel returned to service, 2189. Recommendation, do not leave broken things where humans can find them. Asterisk. She looked at it for a long time after she wrote it. Then she placed it in its frame, under the glass beside the old salvage tag from a ship called the Tenacious. Outside, the galaxy continued. The Nullborn were still out there, quieter, changed, carrying the memory of a battle they had not expected to lose. And the Joint Response Force was being built, ship by ship and decision by decision, with humans and convergent species working at the same level for the first time in history. The Prometheus was flying patrols, learning its range, pushing its boundaries in the way that it always had, finding the edges of what it was capable of and moving them a little further. Dara was on its bridge. Tobias was in the engine room. Vasquez was in the Thorn room. Anand was in the heart, thinking about the cores, making his careful calculations, waiting for the right time to bring his theory to the team. The stars moved past. Somewhere in the outer heliosphere, where the Tenacious had found a dead ship drifting in the dark, there was nothing now but space. The beacon that had once broadcast its careful, cold warning, contaminated, condemned, air do not approach, was silent. It had been deactivated months ago, removed during the Convergence's official transfer of the salvage claim to Earth Authority. The dark out there was just dark again, full of old things, full of possibility, full of whatever humanity would find next.